By May 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. Berlin was falling. German units were surrendering in groups. Entire divisions were laying down their weapons without a fight. The outcome was no longer in question, only the timing. In the mountains of Austria, however, something happened that did not fit this ending. A small American unit. A handful of German soldiers and a group of French prisoners found themselves defending a medieval castle against an attack by the SS, Americans and Germans, fighting side by side, not against a common rumor. Not in confusion, but deliberately in coordination. Against a force that refused to accept the war was over. This was the Battle of Castle. It is one of the strangest and least known engagements of World War II, not because it was large, but because it contradicts everything we expect from the final days of the conflict. The castle itself stood high above the village of Itter, surrounded by forest and steep slopes. For years it had served as a special prison for prominent French figures captured by the Nazis, former prime ministers, generals, political leaders, and resistance members. They were not ordinary prisoners. They were hostages of symbolic value, kept alive for reasons that were no longer clear as the Reich collapsed around them. By early May, the guards assigned to the castle began to disappear. Communication with higher command broke down. Supplies ran low. The SS units in the region became unpredictable, some retreating, others turning violent in the absence of orders. Inside the castle, the prisoners realized something was wrong. They were isolated, forgotten, and surrounded by armed men who no longer answered to anyone. Meanwhile, nearby German army officers were facing a different reality. They knew the war was lost. They had no interest in continuing to fight for a regime that was collapsing. Some were looking for ways to surrender safely to the Americans rather than risk falling into the hands of the SS or Soviet forces. In this chaos, an unusual alliance began to form. A Wehrmacht officer named Joseph Gangl made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Instead of fighting the approaching Americans, he contacted them. He warned them that the prisoners at Castle Itter were in danger from nearby SS units who might try to kill them before the war ended, the Americans. Listened Lieutenant John C. Lee of the U.S. Army did not expect to coordinate with German soldiers, but the information made sense. The SS in the area were known for acting independently, and the prisoners inside the castle were too. It's valuable to ignore. What followed was not a formal plan. It was a decision made quickly, based on trust between men who, days earlier, had been enemies. A small American force, reinforced by German soldiers loyal to Gangl, drove toward the castle to secure it before the SS could reach it. They did not know they were about to fight one of the last battles of the war, a battle in which uniforms would no longer define sides. Castle Itter was not an ordinary prison, hidden in the Austrian Alps. It had been converted by the Nazis into a special detention site for high-profile French prisoners. These were not soldiers captured on the battlefield. They were political figures, former leaders, generals, and members of the French elite, whose names carried weight far beyond the walls of the castle. Among them were former prime ministers, senior military officers, and resistance figures. Men who, under different circumstances, would have shaped the future of France instead. They found themselves confined together in a medieval fortress, surrounded by guards who no longer seemed certain about their own authority. By the spring of 1945, something had changed inside the castle. The guards were nervous. Some had deserted. Supplies arrived irregularly. Communication with the outside world had become unreliable. The prisoners sensed what the guards did not want to admit. Germany was collapsing at first. It felt like hope, but hope quickly turned into fear. If the war was ending, what would happen to them? They were too important to be forgotten, but also too dangerous to be left alive in the eyes of fanatical SS units still loyal to the regime. As chaos spread through the region, the possibility emerged that someone might decide to eliminate them. Rather than risk their liberation, the prisoners could hear distant artillery. They saw guards arguing among themselves. Some of the younger SS men spoke openly about retreating into the mountains. Others talked about fighting to the end inside the castle. The French prisoners began to realize they were caught between forces they could not control. One of them, a former French officer, volunteered to slip out of the castle under cover of darkness. He made his way through forests and villages, trying to find American troops. His message was simple: the prisoners were in danger, and someone needed to reach them before the SS did. At the same time, events outside the castle were moving quickly. Wehrmacht. Major Joseph Gangl had already decided he would not allow his men to be used in pointless fighting. He had been quietly coordinating with the local Austrian resistance and looking for a way to surrender responsibly. When word reached him about the situation at Castle Itter, he saw both a moral obligation and an opportunity. If he could help protect the prisoners, he might also ensure that his men surrendered safely to the Americans rather than risk retaliation from the SS for abandoning their posts. This is how an unlikely chain of communication formed: a French prisoner escaping a Nazi castle, a German officer deciding to defy the SS, and American troops advancing through the mountains without knowing they were about to enter one of the strangest situations of the war, inside the castle. The prisoners waited. They did not know whether help would arrive. They did not know whether the next group of armed men to appear at the gate would be their liberators or their executioners. All they knew was that the world outside was collapsing, and the walls that had held them for years were no longer protection. They were a prize no one could afford to ignore, and time was running out. Asterisk. Major Joseph Gangl was a professional soldier. He had served the German army for years, fought in multiple campaigns, and followed orders through a war that had steadily grown more brutal and more senseless. By the spring of 1945, he no longer believed in the cause he was supposed to defend. Like many Wehrmacht officers at that stage of the war, Gangl understood that Germany had lost. Continuing to fight served no purpose except to produce more unnecessary deaths. Worse, the SS units operating in the region had become unpredictable. Hostile even to other German troops who showed signs of wanting to surrender, Gangl faced a dangerous reality. If he tried to withdraw or negotiate with the Americans, the SS might consider him a traitor. If he continued to fight, he would be sacrificing his men for a regime that was already collapsing. So he made a decision that required quiet courage. He began working with the local Austrian resistance, using his authority to protect civilians from rogue SS elements. He positioned his unit not to fight the Allies, but to keep order as the front lines dissolved into chaos. When he learned about the prisoners at Castle Itter, the situation became more urgent. These were not ordinary detainees. They were prominent French figures whose deaths at the hands of the SS would serve no purpose except revenge and destruction in the final days of the war. Gangl saw clearly what might happen. Fanatical SS soldiers, cut off from command and refusing to surrender, could easily decide to storm the castle and kill everyone inside before disappearing into the mountains. He knew he could not stop them alone. That is when he chose to contact the Americans. This was not an act without risk. Approaching Allied forces while still wearing a German uniform could easily result in being shot. Trust between enemies does not form easily, especially after years of war. But Gangl took the chance. He made contact with a small American reconnaissance unit led by Lieutenant John Seeley. Through interpreters and hurried explanations, he described the situation at the castle and the danger the prisoners faced. Lee listened carefully. The idea that a German officer was asking for help against the SS seemed unusual. But the details matched what American intelligence already knew about SS behavior in collapsing areas. Gangl's proposal was simple. He and his men would help the Americans reach the castle. Together, they would secure it before the SS could act. For Lee, this meant making a decision in minutes that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Trust a German officer, accept German soldiers as allies, and move toward a potential firefight with the SS in the mountains. Lee agreed. What brought them together was not strategy. It was urgency. Inside the castle were men who could not defend themselves. Outside were SS units who might try to kill them, and between them stood a German officer who had decided that the war, for him, was over. He had chosen a side, not Germany, not the Allies, but the side that would prevent a massacre in the final hours of the conflict. Asterisk. Lieutenant John C. Lee did not have a large force at his disposal. He commanded a small reconnaissance unit equipped with a handful of vehicles, light weapons, and limited manpower. This was not a company prepared for a siege. It was a patrol element designed for movement and observation, not defense. Yet the situation at Castle Itter did not allow for delay. Lee gathered what he had: a few American soldiers, a Sherman tank for support, and the German troops under Major Joseph Gangl, who had volunteered to help. The convoy that formed was small, improvised, and unlike anything that had moved through Austria before. American and German soldiers riding together in the same vehicles. Some of Lee's men were uneasy. Days earlier, they had been fighting soldiers wearing the same uniforms as Gangl's unit. Trust did not come naturally. But Gangl's calm, direct manner and the urgency of the mission left little room for doubt. They moved quickly through narrow mountain roads, passing villages where white flags already hung from windows. Civilians watched silently as the strange convoy passed, unsure what they were seeing. When they reached the outskirts of Itter, the castle came into view. Perched high above the valley like something from another century, the group expected to find confusion. Instead, they found tension. The remaining guards had largely fled. A few loyal SS men still lingered in the area, and there were reports that a larger SS unit was nearby. Moving unpredictably through the forests, Lee's force entered the castle grounds and made contact with the prisoners. The Frenchmen inside were shocked to see American troops arrive, and even more surprised to see German soldiers standing beside them as allies. Some of the prisoners, former generals and officers themselves, immediately began discussing defensive positions, offering advice, and volunteering to help if fighting came. There was little time to plan. Lee quickly assessed the situation. The castle had thick stone walls, limited entrances, and high ground good for defense. But the group inside was small. If the SS decided to attack with enough men, they could be overwhelmed. The Sherman tank was positioned at the gate to provide heavy firepower. American and German soldiers took positions along the walls and windows. Weapons were distributed. Ammunition was checked. Inside the castle, former prisoners now stood beside their rescuers, preparing to defend the place that had held them captive for years. The alliance was complete. Not formal, not symbolic, but practical and immediate. They were no longer enemies. They were defenders of the same position, waiting for an attack that seemed increasingly likely. As night fell over the mountains, the forest around the castle grew quiet, too quiet. Everyone inside understood the same thing. The SS would come. Morning came with tension that had barely eased during the night. From the castle walls, the defenders watched the tree line below, scanning for movement. The valley was quiet, but the silence did not feel reassuring. It felt like a pause before something inevitable. They did not have to wait long. Reports reached the castle that an SS unit had been spotted moving through the forest toward Itter. These were not retreating soldiers looking to surrender. They were still armed, organized, and unwilling to accept that the war was ending. For them, the prisoners inside the castle represented unfinished business. The defenders prepared for a fight they could not avoid. Lee positioned his men where they could cover the main approach road. Gangl's German soldiers took up positions they knew would give them the best view of the slopes. The French prisoners, many of whom had military backgrounds, helped reinforce doors and windows, moving with a seriousness that showed they understood what was at stake. When the first shots were fired, they came from the forest. Rifle fire cracked through the trees, followed by bursts of machine gun fire aimed at the castle walls. Stone chipped and splintered under impact. The defenders returned fire immediately, American and German rifles answering in unison. The Sherman tank at the gate opened up with its main gun, sending a blast down the road that forced the SS soldiers to scatter and take cover. For a moment, it seemed like the attackers might hesitate. They did not. The SS regrouped and began probing the defenses, trying to find weak points. They fired from behind trees and rocks, advancing slowly under cover. The defenders could see their shapes moving through the forest, dark against the snow. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was intense, but controlled. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a siege. The French prisoners stayed low, but refused to hide completely. Some helped reload weapons. Others passed messages between positions. They had spent years inside these walls. Now, they were fighting to keep them from becoming their graves. Hours passed in bursts of gunfire and tense quiet. A critical problem emerged quickly. The defenders were running low on ammunition. They had not come prepared for a prolonged fight. Every shot had to count. Lee attempted to radio for reinforcements, but communication was unreliable. The mountains interfered with signals. Help might be on the way, or it might not. The SS pressed closer, testing the perimeter and inside the castle. Americans and Germans fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing ammunition, covering each other's positions, and shouting warnings in two languages that now meant the same thing. The war had created enemies. This moment had erased that distinction. They were all simply defenders trying to hold the line long enough to survive. Asterisk, asterisk, as the firefight stretched into the afternoon, the reality inside Castle Itter became increasingly clear. They could not hold forever. The defenders were outnumbered. Ammunition was running low. The Sherman tank that had guarded the entrance had become a primary target. Repeated fire from the SS eventually disabled it, leaving the gate more vulnerable than before. Without the tank's firepower, the castle felt smaller. The SS began moving closer, using the forest and stone walls for cover. Shots rang out from multiple directions now. Windows shattered. Dust filled the air as bullets struck the ancient masonry. Lee moved between positions, checking on his men and Gangel's soldiers alike. There was no time for formal coordination. Instructions were shouted, repeated, and acted upon immediately in one corridor. A French prisoner passed ammunition to an American rifleman. In another, a German soldier leaned out a window to cover an approach while an American reloaded beside him. The castle had become a single, defensive unit. At one point, a group of SS soldiers tried to rush the outer gate. They were met with concentrated fire from above, forcing them back into the trees. But each attack brought them a little closer, and each exchange consumed precious ammunition. The defenders knew they were in a race against time. If reinforcements did not arrive, the SS would eventually breach the walls. There were too few men to cover every entrance. Indefinitely, then, something unexpected happened. One of the French prisoners, a former general, volunteered to make a dash across the courtyard to repair the radio antenna, which had been damaged by gunfire. Under covering fire from the walls, he ran through the open space, bullets striking the ground around him, and managed to restore the connection. It was a desperate act, but it worked. A signal finally reached American forces in the valley. Help was coming, but the defenders still had to survive long enough for it to arrive. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue began to set in. Hands shook from tension. Faces were blackened with dust and sweat. The air inside the castle smelled of gunpowder and stone. Major Gangel moved between positions just as Lee did, encouraging his men, checking sight, and ensuring no approach went unwept. Then, as he looked out from a window to spot enemy movement, a sniper's bullet struck him. Gangel fell. Mortally wounded, the German officer who had chosen to stand with the Americans and protect the prisoners had been killed in the final hours of the war. His men continued fighting. There was no time to stop. They held their positions, knowing that the sound of engines in the distance, faint at first, meant the end of the siege was near. But until those engines reached the castle, the line still had to be held. Asterisk, asterisk, late in the afternoon, the sound that everyone inside the castle had been waiting for finally reached them. Engines, at first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the echoes of gunfire in the valley. Then it grew louder, steady, and unmistakable. Vehicles were climbing the narrow mountain road toward it. The SS heard it too. Their fire became more urgent, less controlled. Some began pulling back into the trees, unsure of how many troops were arriving. Others tried to press their attack one last time, hoping to break through before the situation turned against them. Inside the castle, the defenders did not slow down. They kept firing, conserving what ammunition they had left, holding their positions as if the reinforcements might never arrive. No one relaxed. No one moved from cover. Then American troops appeared on the road below. Infantry supported by armored vehicles advanced toward the castle, firing into the forest as they moved. The SS position, which had been pressing forward for hours, collapsed quickly under the new pressure.